Millions of Americans are set to cast their ballots today to elect the 47th President of the United States of America. Democratic candidate Kamala Harris and Republican Donald Trump are running neck and neck in the election race. Let's now bring in the director of the African Center for African Studies of the United States, at the University of Pretoria, Professor Christopher Isike, for some analysis around this. Prof, a very good morning to you. Thank you so much for making time for us. So as we watch Americans head to the polls, and knowing, of course, that here we're also speaking about the biggest economy in the world, what are some of the important aspects that we should be looking into around also what that outcome would mean for the world at large, and also considering the impact that this could have on geopolitics?
Good morning, Andren, and thank you for having me on your show. The starting point in terms of the impact of the American elections, depending on who becomes president, is for the world to understand that America's interests will always be number one, and that is their right to look after their interests, to be up to the rest of the world to calibrate and articulate their own interests and ensure that they go into negotiations or discussions that align, interests for mutual benefit. So that's one. So depending on who wins, you will see in terms of foreign policy, Kamala Harris, supports an active global role for the United States, including in NATO and other military alliances that they have. And she wants to continue to send aid to Ukraine, for example. She has not quite given clear details of her policies towards China, but she does want to, protect the United States from China's economic practices, but without doing it in such a way that she's able to maintain relations with China. Trump, on the other hand, has criticized NATO and suggested that he would encourage Russia to invade, a member country if he didn't think that that country was paying enough for its own defense. He's indicated reluctance to send military aid to Ukraine, and he wants to eliminate the United States' economic dependence on China. So maybe that's one of the areas where their interests align. However, the fundamental difference between the two is that Trump wants to look at America, is very transactional in his approach to how he sees the rest of the world, whereas the Biden administration, and I think that there will be a continuation of that, is more and more engagement with continents like ours to ensure that American interests remain sacrosanct.
Yeah. And speaking about those American interests, one of the other aspects that have come out time and time again is when we look at geopolitics and specifically the war in Gaza, is that when it comes to Israel, no matter who the president of the United States is, that president will align more with Israel than what they would with Palestinians. Kamala Harris took a bit of a different tune, some would say, with the remarks that she made during her campaign in Georgia, that she wants to see an end to the war in Gaza. But what impact does that have in the decision-making of the electorate today when they decide who to vote for?
Well, they would have impact, marginal impact, but every vote counts in this kind of close, tight elections, as we have seen from the polls. So for people in Michigan, especially the most large Muslim community in Michigan, her stance would, impact on how much votes she would get from there. And also, if she doesn't tread delicately on it, she may also end up irritating the Jewish votes, which is huge, which is popular, which is very big in America, apart from the money, of course. So I think the calculation has been that it's better for her to tread carefully and not come out very strong against Israel, because if it's better to lose the Muslim votes in Michigan than to irritate the Jewish community, which spreads across different states in the country. So, but I think that one of the ways that she would be a bit different from Biden is in having much more frank discussion, America being more decisive in using its leverage against Israel, and they have a lot of leverage. If Israel will not do any of the things it's doing without American support, so if you have a president that is not sold on Netanyahu's antics, that president may be able to cut his wings, and I think that that's what needs to happen for any kind of mileage from this conflict.
Yeah. The other point that I want to stress here also is around how wars have an impact on how Americans decide. We know, for instance, with the decision of George W. Bush and the invasion of Afghanistan. I wonder with this particular one, whether you speak about Ukraine or you speak about the war in Gaza, do the American electorate see it through the same lens as what they looked at it during the time when George Bush decided that there is going to be this invasion of Afghanistan? And we know, of course, what later happened with the Trump deciding that, listen, we are now going to pull out the troops.
So Americans generally don't like war. They don't like presidents who engage in wars, whether directly or indirectly. And this is one of Trump's talking points. There's this rhetoric that is putting across that he would end all wars, that during his term there was no wars, and that he would end all wars because he knows how to deal with Iran, he knows how to deal with Palestine, he knows how to deal with Russia and Ukraine. That is the myth that he has created, forgetting that he was part of the cause, one of the causal factors for the conflicts in Ukraine and as well as even the one in Palestine, considering the fact that he moved the capital to Jerusalem, the Israeli capital to Jerusalem. So it is important. However, in America, the usual issues have always been the economy, issues around migration, local issues. But for some reason, despite the fact that the economy is still the strongest in the world, people tend to look at other factors. So it tells you that there's a bit of a culture war between different segments of society going on there. And any excuse that would portray one as strong and the other as weak, even in the world stage, can be a deciding factor. And I think that that's what's happening here. Trump has portrayed himself as someone who can stand straight to any president and fix global problems. Whereas the Biden administration, Harris in pseudo, is being accused of causing wars that they've not been able to address. So foreign policy will also become an issue, especially when you look at how tight they say the race. I don't believe that the race is as tight as the polls are telling us. But in this kind of situation, the best thing is for everyone to be careful and go for every single vote, whether it's a foreign policy vote or a domestic issue vote.
Yeah. Let's quickly look at the G20 and members of the G20. How do they look at these elections and the outcomes of these elections? If you take into consideration, of course, South Africa takes over the presidency of the G20, and if you look at some of the aspects that needs to be dealt with, is the issue around strengthening of the World Trade Organization, the WTO, and we know the concerns that have been raised during the Trump administration around protectionism, and whether protectionism under the Trump administration in fining people and also increasing some of the import fees as well would have an impact around, the tariffs, yes, that's it, would have an impact around how they view, this is now members of the G20, how the outcome of the elections would have an impact on them.
Yeah, surely, you've said it all. They are worried, whether it's Europe, Japan, many of the G20 countries, including even China, are worried about a Trump presidency because they know that it would mean an inward-looking America, and not one that is done out of careful consideration, but one that may be done carelessly, as we saw Trump did when he withdrew the U.S. from the World Health Organization in his last months in office, as well as the Paris Agreement. So with a Trump presidency, you see an inward-looking America that withdraws from the world under the false notion that making America great again is really about America focusing on its local politics. So the alliances are worried about that kind of erraticness that we saw during the Trump era, and they worry that if that were to repeat itself, it will turn back some of the gains that have been made in trying to forge multilateral efforts to solutions to some of the wicked problems that we face globally, and this is a legitimate concern from members of the G20.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time, Prof. Christopher Isike there. Ahead of Americans heading to the polls, they go to the polls today to elect the 47th President of the United States. Thank you so much for your time.